Skenno. I hope everyone is carrying the great peace. My name is Greg Henhawk. I'm a Mohawk of the Bear Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory in southern Ontario. I'd like to begin with a traditional Haudenosaunee address, at least in an abbreviated version. Ona, all of you assembled, hear my words, for this is the first order of business. The words that come before all else, a message of thanksgiving. We offer our greetings and our thanks to the people, that they will be at peace. Now our minds are one. We have all been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now we bring our minds together as one, as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. We offer our greetings and our thanks to all the living things on earth that help us. Now our minds are one. We have now arrived at the place where we end our words. Of all the things we named, it was not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. So let all these things be in our mind and in our hearts. That is the message that I have for you. That is all. Nyawa. So what I have shared is the opening passage and the closing passage, a very brief, abbreviated example of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address. There are many versions. It is a message of being grateful, giving thanks. It's not to be confused with the holiday. A full version takes more time and addresses many more aspects of the world and the place of humans in it. Giving thanks as people gather together is not a recitation of a hierarchy and is not a prayer. Through these words, our minds are gathered together to show our thankfulness for what nature provides us. It also acknowledges the ongoing impact of these forces on human lives. Giving thanks as people gathered together is the beginning of becoming one mind. And being of one good mind is the ideal condition of all people. So what is the purpose for sharing this today? I share it to conceptualize the diversity of Indigenous people. The Six Nations are a small portion of the approximately 650 First Nations across Canada, and then you still have the Métis and the Inuit that make up the Indigenous people of Canada. I share to illustrate the oratory ability and record keeping through stories by Indigenous peoples, all across Turtle Island. Stories are our data. They exist to inform and guide decision making. They were not written, but they were preserved in detail just the same. I share to introduce the layers of thought within Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. Primitive we were not. The U.S. Constitution is based on the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's governance structure. And that's a prime example of the depth of our culture. But unfortunately, an aspect usually only known on a surface level by settler society. I share to provide insight into the reason Indigenous people think the way they do. A holistic connection of cycles and change, concepts of good versus right, and the importance of adaptability and balance across all aspects of life. I share that which has been shared with me to promote thought from different perspectives. Holistic thinking. Because it's holistic, it applies not only to life, but it also applies to sport. They're all connected. They are all part of the same holistic conceptualization. Since childhood, I've always been taught to talk with people as opposed to at people. This shows respect, promotes trust, and also promotes unity or equality. After thankfulness, the next order of business is always connection. For that is where the real power lies. It exists in equitable relationships among people. Holistic thinking does not promote silos, separation of aspects of your life, and keeping them disconnected. One of the things that I always find interesting about business models and business thinking is the quote you see on the screen. Don't take it personal, it's just business. That's a very foreign concept, not only to holistic thinkers, but also to Indigenous people. How you can separate yourself and act one way in one situation and then think that it's going to be fine, especially if it was negative behavior. Raising a council fire. It's a number of reminders within our philosophy for a good path, and I'll be speaking about that in the next few slides. Finally, should we be discussing inclusion or should we be discussing unity? For me, inclusion tends to be a one-way street. I firmly believe that thinking new should be a two-way street. So how do we connect? How do we build these relationships that I speak of? Non-Indigenous people often ask, what can we do for you Indigenous people? But what they should be asking is a new way of thinking. What can we do together? We do not wish and have never wished to be cared for as children. We wish to be respected as equals. And then the relationships develop much differently from that point forward. The good path I speak of, relationship building. In Indigenous and tribal cultures, fire represents many things. It is warmth, light, protection. That's the literal interpretation. But it can also symbolize heart and home. It can also symbolize a gathering, like our discussions today. It can symbolize a council, a unity of peace, power, and a good message. And that's what I'm going to speak about next. The good message. The good message is people respecting each other as though we are one person. A good message is understanding everyone is connected with each other and the world that surrounds us. We must commit to respect, trust, and friendship. We must transform adversaries into allies. We must insist on equality and reciprocity as integral to respect. Now our minds are one. Peace. Peace is more than just a word. It's an idea. It's also a process. And it's also an action. Peace is health and wellness, and it does not stop at a healthy body, a good mind, and a good heart. It extends beyond to a healthy society. It extends to all our relations in the world that surround us. The Thanksgiving address speaks to the natural world and all the aspects make it up, a holistic picture that welcomes and connects all people and all things. We are part of the peace. We all have our role. We are not the owner nor the master of it, but we are responsible for our part. Power. Power is not what many may think. It is the power of togetherness within our diversity. A lasting good is sustained by establishing relationships and actions that are continually examined, and not just from a single transaction or policy or checkbox. It is sustained from the process of continually sharing our diverse voices, languages, and thoughts. In Haudenosaunee history, there's what is called the Hiawatha Belt. It's also considered the Six Nations or Haudenosaunee flag. Within the Hiawatha Belt, there is a reminder of the unity of purpose and at the same time the maintenance of diverse identities. Showing on the screen here, this is the representation of the original 5 nations. Each one of the rectangles represents a distinct nation. On the right-hand side, you have the Mohawks, which is the keepers of the Eastern Door. Then you have the Oneidas. The tree in the middle represents the Onondaga, the fire keepers. Then you have the Cayuga. And then finally on the left-hand side, you have the Senecas, who are the keepers of the Western Door. Notice that they're all connected, and this represents the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Grand Council of 50 chiefs. It also represents that each individual nation that makes up the Confederacy still retains their identity, still retains their own council. They do not all become exactly the same. They still retain their different practices, but they also share a lot of practices in common. And you'll notice that on the end, the connections are open. The Tuscaroras joined us later, after the Hiawatha Belt was produced, and now that's why we are 6 nations rather than the original 5 nations. There's work to be done on both sides. The raising, keeping, and lowering of a council fire represents a focus on the work to be done without distraction of blame, shame, or revenge. We need to be guided by the wisdom that such a unity that we create today requires open communication, truth, understanding, learning, and of course actions. A council fire never goes out. It is a process thinking of 7 generations into the future. It never stops. A good path includes diversity, equity, and cultural literacy. Comfort with differences. I don't think a lot of people are comfortable with that, or there's a one-size-fits-all or a one right way to have done this historically. We have to have new thinking. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spoke of, "You're perpetuating problems if you believe everyone's reality is the same as your own. And if and when you find out it isn't, you actually believe it should be." That creates a lot of problems. A major piece of reconciliation in change culture is understanding the need for change and thinking and believing and committing to, I can change. The great law, Haudenosaunee philosophy, it's the Haudenosaunee ways of knowing and doing, focuses primarily on principles of purpose as opposed to only singular unchanging specifics. And one must always be prepared and willing to think new. The natural world continually adapts over time. It finds a way. People should too. A good way as opposed to the right way or the only way. Cultural literacy, diversity acceptance. Diversity is served by listening to the truths of the past, acknowledging necessary actions in the present, and being prepared to adapt for the future. To create a better future for those who we have not yet seen. A better place not only for our children, but also our children's children. 7 generations in the future. This has always been the goal of our ancestors' wisdom. A good mind and a good heart will always join with other good minds and hearts, for that is where the real power lies. So what are these actions? One is to examine the truths of the past without blame, shame, or revenge. Within the truth, there is always the danger of a single story. There is actually a need for many stories, multiple stories, lifelong learning as opposed to singular perspectives or stereotypes. Stereotypes exist because of people grasping on to a single story of a people or an event or a situation. Stereotypes are not always untrue, but they are always incomplete. You need those multiple stories. An example is rationalizing injustices of the past. Savages? What's the solution of dealing with them? Residential schools? There absolutely needs to be more choices and decisions and discussion. Recognizing unconscious biases. Gandhi said, we all have our misgivings. And we do not always know why we think the way that we do. That needs to be examined. Learning from the past means examining the past with all its misgivings and not rationalizing or ignoring them. Has the world through time ever truly attempted to decolonize and change its thoughts in order to build a new world? Or has it just continued to preserve the old one, misgivings and all? Food for thought. So, speaking of change and thinking new, it is not always about what needs to be added. Critical analysis needs to question the status quo as opposed to assuming it is the best path, simply because it's always been done that way. How often do people or organizations look at what is not working and conclude nothing needs to change? We just simply need to add something from our perspective. That's that concept of inclusion. A one-way street or a two-way. Okay? Come and join our ways rather than creating something together. Consider breaking the cycle of unconscious bias entrenched in the premise that one only needs to add more of the same rather than think new. Doing the same thing over and over expecting a different result. I'm sure people have heard that quote before. So, moving forward into the future, there needs to be understanding before action, and then a holistic approach, a multifaceted one that includes both continual learning and actions. Test and adapt, test and adapt. Literacy of any kind never truly ends. Lifelong learning and adaptation takes generations and patience. Cultural and diversity literacy is part of the recipe for a new world. Once you know the truths and appreciate the impacts, you can forge a new good path moving forward. Think new. How do we clear our minds of the biases of the past? Well, it's never going to be 100%. There will always be that aspect of life. One possibility is the Haudenosaunee condolence ceremony. Its main principle is no shame, no blame, no revenge. Returning to a good mind and a good heart and a good path. There is work to be done on both sides with regards to this. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what's going to happen when you do that critical analysis. Break the cycle of discomfort. Create a good path, a good mind, and a good heart. I'm often told and then asked, I just don't feel comfortable. How do I engage with Indigenous people? And also the opposite perspective. I just don't feel comfortable dealing with non-Indigenous people, non-Native people. How do I engage with the settler people? How do I engage with mainstream? It's a question that I have to ponder quite often. Well, it's going to be a long journey. A long journey begins with a single step. And this challenge is a long journey, a process, a generational process of continual discovery, change, adaptation, and constantly returning to or finding a new balance. Being comfortable with finding a way to begin and think new. And if we do not change, I think this quote kind of illustrates where we will end up. Nelson Mandela said before he left prison, "As I stand before the door to my freedom, I realize that if I do not leave my pain, anger, and bitterness behind me, I will still be in prison." Nyawagoa, thank you with great respect for listening to my thoughts and stories that have been shared today. We'll now entertain questions.
Thank you, Greg, for that insightful presentation. I always appreciate hearing your words of wisdom. It's given us a lot to think about as we bring some of these thoughts back to our different sport communities. So I just wanted to start with a question. What are some tangible first steps for organizations that wish to work alongside Indigenous communities to form better connections and foster unity?
I would say that the first step I mentioned in my presentation, and it's creating a connection. There's a lot of power in just reaching out and creating the dialogue. And as I mentioned in my second last slide there, I often get asked, I just don't know how. I don't know really how. Sometimes I even try to compare it to dating. A lot of people have trouble with dating. They don't know how to go say and make that first connection. I think that's in the same type of situation. My grandmother and a lot of elders that I've connected with over the years consistently said, well, if it's coming from a good mind and a good heart and you're doing it respectfully, it's not going to be incorrect. I think the greatest fear comes from interacting with Indigenous people and even non-Indigenous people who they're at a place in their journey, in the case of Indigenous people, in their healing journey where they're still angry. So they really, they're more adversarial than they are welcoming to a new relationship at this point. And I think that sticks in people's minds, unfortunately. It sticks in minds because that's the people who make the news. That's the people who are out there and they see that, well, okay, I don't want to anger these people. I don't want to anger the Indigenous people. That also shows respect, though. The fact that they're starting to respect what has gone in the past. So I think all of that together goes into the same equation of just saying, okay, you need to just begin. You need to reach out. You need to create that relationship, no matter how difficult it may seem, in making that first connection. And I think it just starts with a good mind and good heart, and go from there.
Yeah, that was great. I think it's like you said, it's sometimes the how-to can be hard, but I thought that spoke to a good approach to get started. And the points you made on power were also incredibly thoughtful and provoking. I wondered if you have any recommendations for ways to better share and hear the diverse voices and thoughts of people across Canada.
Well, I think the biggest thing again goes back to something that I did mention, in that either recognizing it or learning and realizing that there's 600 I'll say approximately 650 different countries in Canada, and that's what existed when the settlers first arrived. And even to this day, people will come up to me and say, well, I'm Indigenous. And I'll say, okay, what nation? And their response is, I'm Indigenous. And I'll say, well, okay, but what nation are you? And they don't know. So their limited knowledge and limited understanding, they might have Indigenous ties to blood or culture, but again, their understanding of what that collective terminology means and just what existed prior to settlers coming to North America, and wrapping their head around it, I think, is incredibly difficult. I've had a gentleman say, well, there's got to be a collective term for you. There has to be. And I said, well, why does there have to be? But again, it goes back to that idea. What's the reason we think the way that we do? We've been stereotyped as being one autonomous people, and we're not. But we also have a lot of similarities and philosophies and things that connects us as well. And it connects us to all people. But obviously, we've got a closer connection to each other with our practices and philosophies. So, going from there, that power of connection, again, goes forward. But it's understanding that you're not going to be able to create a one-size-fits-all policy. And I think a country the size of Canada is almost an antithesis sometimes of some of the philosophies of Indigenous people. We didn't seek to have one governance system that encompasses all of Canada. We respected each other, like I said, with the Hiawatha Belt. Sure, we band together as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but we also retain our different practices within the Mohawk Longhouse, the Cayuga Longhouse, the Onondaga Longhouse, and then all the other 650 communities, nations that exist in Canada also do the same thing.
Great, thank you so much. And knowing there's a lot of researchers in the audience today, what would you say are some maybe best practices, or for researchers who are interested in doing research with Indigenous communities or incorporating an Indigenous perspective or lens on the research they're doing? What are some, I guess, ways they might reach out or start to develop a good relationship with those different communities?
As hard as this may seem to hear, it goes back to the fact that we're not children, even though the government, right in the Constitution says that they have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of us. And so then that mindset is perpetuated by, okay, we're going to do something for you. What can we do for you? And again, that goes back to that one-way street that I talked about as well and mentioned. And, people will come forward and say, okay, we want to help you, rather than saying, okay, what do you need? And how do we work together to try and work towards some type of resolution of that challenge? And the final thing I think with that too also comes clear with the idea of thinking that there is a definitive answer. I mentioned that concept of right versus good. In a lot of Indigenous languages, and I know in Mohawk, there is not a direct translation for right, that conceptualization of right. It's good, because good leaves the door open for creativity. Good leaves the door open for adapting and changing. And you have to admit sometimes that you can do all your research, you can do all your due diligence and come up with what you believe is the best decision and still be incorrect. But I've actually engaged with organizations who have then said, oh, well, we can't admit that we were wrong. We can't look bad. So they would rather look better outwardly than fix the actual problem. And so I think, starting from that standpoint and coming in and saying what we're going to, what we would like to work with you together, what do you need? How can we help? Those are the types of engagement that need to happen, and actually truly believe in that, rather than thinking, okay, I've got this for you. Or this is what I can bring to you and give you. This is what we can do for you. Believing that because maybe they've worked with another organization or an Indigenous community, that they now have the skill or the ability to apply that same knowledge. And again, there might be some things that are transferable, but the diversity within the country just makes it, really doesn't make it prohibitive. It just makes it more challenging, and it means more work.
Great. Thank you, Greg. That seems like a great place to wrap up. I'm sure everyone's excited for lunch. And I just wanted to say, great backdrop today. It looks like you're in a very beautiful location.
That's one of my travels photos. It's actually Lake Superior.
It looks beautiful.
When I was traveling back from the International Physical Literacy Conference.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Greg.